Look around you. If you're watching this from Tokyo, Los Angeles, Mumbai or Stockholm, take a moment to really look at the people in your city, the faces you see, the skin tones, the eye shapes, the hair textures. They're all human, but they're all wonderfully different. Why is that? How did one species scattered across the globe become so beautifully diverse? Here's something that should blow your mind. Every single human alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our ancestry back to a small group of people who lived in Africa between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. We're all Africans, if you go back far enough. One species, one origin, one family tree. But if you saw someone from Beijing standing next to someone from Arizona, you'd immediately notice differences. Different facial features, different builds, adaptations that seem almost designed for different worlds. So what happened? How did we become so different? The answer is one of the most fascinating stories in all of human history. It's a tale of migration and isolation, of ice ages and deserts, of mountains that separated peoples for thousands of years, and oceans that kept them apart for even longer. It's about how the environment literally shaped our bodies, how the crops we domesticated changed our cultures, and how tens of thousands of years of living in different corners of the world created the incredible diversity we see today. Picture this. It's about 70,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier. A small group of humans, perhaps just a few hundred individuals, stands at the edge of Africa. They're looking out at a world that's completely unknown to them. The Middle East stretches before them, and beyond that, Asia, Europe, eventually the Americas. Every continent except Antarctica will one day hold their descendants. But right now, they have no idea what's ahead. No maps, no guides, no way to know that this decision to leave will change everything. These weren't the first humans to leave Africa. Others had tried before and failed. But something about this group was different. Maybe they were smarter, more adaptable, or just incredibly lucky. Whatever it was, they survived, and their descendants kept moving, kept exploring, kept pushing into new territories that had never seen a human footprint. Some went east, following coastlines, river valleys, eventually reaching South Asia, Southeast Asia, and finally crossing into what we now call East Asia. Others went west and north into Europe. Much later, some of their descendants would make one of the most incredible journeys in human history, crossing from Asia into the Americas during the Ice Age, when sea levels were so low that a land bridge connected the continents. For thousands and thousands of years, these populations stayed mostly separate. The people who settled in what would become China had virtually no contact with those who eventually reached the Americas. Mountain ranges like the Himalayas created barriers that were nearly impossible to cross. Oceans became walls between worlds. Deserts separated communities for centuries. And in that isolation, something remarkable happened. Humans began to adapt, not just culturally but physically, genetically. People living in the frozen north developed bodies that conserved heat more efficiently. Those near the equator maintained darker skin that protected against intense UV radiation, while populations at higher latitudes evolved lighter skin to better produce vitamin D in lower light conditions. Populations at high altitudes developed enhanced abilities to process oxygen. Those who relied on fishing and marine resources evolved better fat metabolism. But the differences went far deeper than what we can see. The foods that different populations ate shaped their genetics in surprising ways. The animals they domesticated exposed them to different diseases, forcing their immune systems to evolve in different directions. The social structures they built influenced which traits were valuable, which individuals had children, and which genes got passed down through generations. Take Asia and the Americas as just two examples of this incredible story. Both were populated by the same ancestral humans, people who ultimately came from the same African source. But one population arrived in Asia perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, while the other crossed into the Americas maybe 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Different times, different routes, different environments, different pressures, and over thousands of years those differences added up. The really mind-bending part? These changes happened relatively quickly in evolutionary terms. Tens of thousands of years sounds like forever, but it's just a blink in the timeline of life on Earth. Yet it was enough time for humans to adapt to nearly every environment this planet could throw at them. So why did Americans and Asians evolve so differently? The answer involves ice ages, ancient migrations, isolated populations, revolutionary discoveries in agriculture, and the profound ways that geography shapes destiny. It's a story written in our genes, preserved in ancient bones, and painted across the landscape of human diversity we see today. Let's start at the beginning, when a small group of our ancestors decided to leave Africa and walk into the unknown. Picture this. 70,000 years ago, somewhere in East Africa, a young woman stands at the edge of the known world. Behind her, scattered bands of humans live in the grasslands and forests that had been home to their ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. Ahead of her, across a narrow strait of water, lies Arabia. Unknown territory, empty horizons, a world that no human has ever explored. She doesn't know she's about to participate in the most important journey in human history. She's just looking for food, for water, for a place where her children might have a better chance of survival. But that decision, made by her and maybe a few hundred others like her, would determine the genetic destiny of billions of people yet to be born. This wasn't the first time humans had tried to leave Africa. The archaeological record shows earlier attempts, small groups venturing into the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, maybe earlier. But those expeditions failed. The migrants either died out or retreated back to Africa. Climate was probably the killer. The world outside Africa was experiencing wild fluctuations, ice ages sweeping down from the north, deserts expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. Those early pioneers weren't adapted for it. They couldn't compete with the Neanderthals who had already claimed the best territories, so they disappeared, leaving behind only a few stone tools and some fragmentary bones to mark their passing. But this time was different. The humans leaving Africa around 70,000 years ago carried something their predecessors hadn't possessed. They were the products of another bottleneck, another genetic refinement that had happened within Africa itself. Around 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted in the largest volcanic explosion of the last 2 million years. The eruption threw so much ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere that it triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, maybe decades. Temperatures plummeted, rainfall patterns collapsed, food chains disintegrated across the planet. In Africa, the human population crashed again. Genetic analysis suggests we dropped to somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals, maybe less. For thousands of years, our ancestors survived in scattered refugees, small pockets of habitability in an otherwise hostile landscape. And once again, that crisis selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. The humans who emerged from the Toba bottleneck were different. They had developed new technologies, composite tools made from multiple materials, hafted spears, probably throwing devices like atlatls that extended their hunting range. They had refined their use of fire to the point where they could survive in almost any climate. They had developed clothing from animal skins, crucial for life outside the tropics. Most importantly, they had developed what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, the full package of cognitive abilities that defines our species: abstract thinking, symbolic representation, the ability to plan far into the future and learn from the distant past. Language sophisticated enough to convey complex ideas across generations. These were the humans who finally succeeded in leaving Africa, and they didn't just survive outside their homeland. They exploded across the planet faster than any large mammal in history. The route they took has been debated for decades, but genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly points to what scientists call the coastal migration theory. Instead of trudging through the harsh interior deserts of Arabia and the Middle East, our ancestors hugged the coastlines. They followed the shore of the Red Sea, then spread along the southern coast of Arabia, across what is now Pakistan and India, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and beyond. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. Coastlines provide reliable resources: shellfish, seabirds, fish, seaweed, all available year-round regardless of seasonal fluctuations inland. You don't need elaborate technology to exploit coastal resources, just basic tools and knowledge passed down through generations, and perhaps most importantly, coastlines provide navigation. You can't get lost when you're following the shore. Just keep the ocean on your left or right, and you know you're heading in a consistent direction. The genetic evidence for this coastal migration is written in our DNA. Modern populations across Asia, from Yemen to Indonesia to Australia, show a distinctive pattern. They all carry genetic markers that trace back to a single founding population, probably numbering just a few thousand individuals who left Africa around 70,000 years ago. This is what geneticists call a founder effect. When a small group splits off from a larger population, they carry only a subset of the original genetic diversity. It's like reaching into a jar of mixed beans and pulling out a handful. You'll get some of each type, but not in the same proportions as the full jar. The handful becomes the seed stock for all future generations, so whatever genetic variants happen to be in that original sample get amplified. This founder effect shows up in interesting ways. All non-African populations have slightly less genetic diversity than African populations, because we're all descended from that small founding group. We also share specific genetic markers that are rare or absent in Africa, signatures of the bottleneck our ancestors went through when they left the continent. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The genetic evidence shows that this wasn't a single exodus. It was a wave, groups splitting off from groups, populations budding off populations, spreading eastward along the coasts in a process that took thousands of years. Each split created another bottleneck, another founder effect. The farther east you go, the less genetic diversity you find. Populations in Southeast Asia have less diversity than populations in India. Australian Aboriginals, who represent some of the earliest branches of the out-of-Africa migration, have less diversity than Southeast Asians. This pattern of decreasing diversity creates what geneticists call a genetic gradient. Like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in water, each wave carries less information than the one before. The centre holds the most diversity. The edges hold the least. Now, wherever you're watching this from at whatever time it is, whether it's midnight in Mumbai or early morning in Melbourne, your ancestors made this journey. If you've got Asian, European, or Native American ancestry, you carry genes that travelled the coastal route out of Africa 70,000 years ago. Drop a comment and let me know where you are right now, what time it is, and whether you're drifting off to sleep or just starting your day. It's wild to think we're all connected through this ancient journey. Imagine what it must have been like for those early migrants. Small bands, maybe 30 or 40 people travelling together. Extended families probably. Multiple generations moving as a unit. They would have travelled slowly, not covering vast distances in single journeys, but gradually expanding their range generation by generation. A group settles in one location, has children, and some of those children eventually move a few miles down the coast to establish their own camps. Over centuries, this process could move a population thousands of miles without any individual travelling very far. They were venturing into territories that had never seen human footprints, beaches where no one had ever collected shells, forests where no one had ever hunted, rivers no one had ever fished. Every day brought discoveries, new plants, some edible, some poisonous, new animals, some dangerous, some potential food sources, new landscapes requiring new strategies for survival, and they were successful beyond anything their African ancestors could have imagined. Within just 15,000 years, humans had spread from East Africa to Southeast Asia, a distance of roughly 8,000 miles. That's faster than any other large mammal migration in the fossil record. Within 30,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached Australia, requiring sophisticated boat building and navigation skills to cross at least 50 miles of open ocean. This wasn't just migration, this was colonization on a planetary scale, and it was happening because those 70,000-year-old humans carried something special. The genetic and cultural inheritance of multiple bottlenecks, multiple refinements, hundreds of thousands of years of natural selection for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. But as they spread, they were also changing. Each new environment presented new challenges: colder climates, different food sources, novel diseases, and human evolution, which had never really stopped, was about to accelerate in ways that would create the differences we see between populations today. The stage was set. Humans had left Africa and were spreading across Asia. What happened next would determine why Asian and American populations evolved so differently, why some humans developed one set of adaptations while others developed something completely different. The story was just beginning, and it was about to get really interesting. Those few hundred individuals who crossed from Africa into Arabia 60,000 years ago had no idea what they were starting. They were just looking for food, for water, for territories where their children might survive. But they were about to populate the largest, most diverse landmass on Earth, and in doing so, they would become something new. The Arabian Peninsula they entered wasn't the desert wasteland it is today. The climate was wetter, more hospitable. Grasslands stretched where sand dunes now dominate. Rivers flowed through valleys that are now bone dry. Your ancestors followed those rivers, following the game animals that had also migrated out of Africa, following the promise of empty lands where competition for resources would be less fierce. Within a few thousand years, they had spread across the entire Arabian Peninsula and reached the Persian Gulf. And here they faced a choice that would echo through history: west into Europe, where their distant cousins the Neanderthals had already established themselves, or east into the vast unknown territories of Asia. Most went east. The archaeological evidence shows a rapid coastal migration, small groups hugging the shorelines of what is now Iran, Pakistan, India. They travelled during an ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. Coastlines that now underwater were prime real estate, rich in shellfish, fish, and sea mammals. These coastal migrants moved fast, covering thousands of miles in just a few millennia. Some researchers call it the beachcomber migration, humans following a highway of seafood from the Persian Gulf, all the way to Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. But not everyone stayed on the coast. Some groups turned inland, following rivers up into the heart of Asia. And here's where things get really interesting. Because Asia isn't one environment, it's dozens, maybe hundreds. From the frozen steppes of Siberia to the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. From the highest mountains on Earth to river valleys so fertile they would eventually support civilizations of millions. Each environment posed different challenges, each selected for different traits. The groups that moved into South Asia encountered something unprecedented: the monsoons. These weren't just seasonal rains like anything they'd experienced in Africa. These were climate systems of staggering power. 6 months of intense rainfall followed by 6 months of relative drought. Rivers that would swell to 10 times their normal size, then shrink to streams. This created a landscape of extreme abundance alternating with extreme scarcity. Your ancestors adapted by becoming planners. You couldn't just live day to day in monsoon country. You had to store food during the wet season, preserve it through the dry months. You had to understand cycles, predict patterns, think months or even years ahead. Natural selection favoured intelligence, memory, the ability to learn complex patterns and pass that knowledge to your children. Archaeological sites from this period show an explosion of storage technologies. Baskets, clay containers, underground pits lined with materials that kept food dry and protected from pests. This might not sound revolutionary, but it represented a fundamental shift in human thinking, from living in the present to planning for the future. The monsoon regions also created something else. They created an environment where cooperation was survival. When rivers flooded, individual families couldn't protect themselves, but communities working together could build barriers, redirect water, save each other's food stores. When drought came, groups that shared resources survived. Groups that hoarded died when their stores ran out. Over thousands of generations, this selected for social intelligence, the ability to navigate complex relationships, maintain alliances, remember debts and favours. Modern South Asian populations show genetic variants associated with enhanced social cognition, possibly adaptations to millennia of monsoon living. But the monsoons also did something unexpected. They isolated populations. During the wet season, travel became nearly impossible. Rivers became barriers instead of highways. Mountains that were passable in the dry season turned into waterfalls and mudslides. This created what geneticists call population structure. Groups living just a few dozen miles apart could be effectively isolated for half the year, every year, for thousands of years. This isolation led to drift, random genetic changes accumulating in different populations. Combined with selection for local adaptations, it began creating the diversity we see in Asian populations today. Not dramatic differences, not separate species, but subtle variations in everything from disease resistance to metabolism to facial features. Meanwhile, other groups were pushing further east, into what is now China and East Asia, and here they encountered something that would change human history forever. The Denisovans. Remember them? That mysterious third human species that had split off from our common ancestors hundreds of thousands of years earlier. They were already established across Asia, already adapted to local conditions. And when modern humans arrived, something remarkable happened. They didn't fight, or at least not only fight, they interbred. The genetic evidence is unmistakable. Modern Asian populations carry significant Denisovan DNA, much more than populations in other parts of the world. Some estimates suggest 3 to 5% of the genome in East Asian populations comes from Denisovan ancestors. In some isolated groups in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it's even higher. This wasn't just random interbreeding, it was adaptive. The Denisovans had been in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had evolved genes that helped them survive in Asian environments. Genes for processing local foods, genes for resisting local diseases, genes for functioning in everything from tropical heat to Himalayan cold. When modern humans interbred with Denisovans, they acquired these adaptations instantly. Not through the slow process of natural selection over thousands of generations, but through a genetic shortcut. One generation of mixing, and their children carried survival tools refined over hundreds of millennia. One of the most dramatic examples is altitude adaptation. Some modern Tibetan populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help them process oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the Himalayan plateau. Without these genes, living permanently above 13,000 feet would be nearly impossible. With them, Tibetan populations not only survive but thrive, maintaining healthy pregnancies and raising children in conditions that would cause severe altitude sickness in most people. Other Denisovan genes provided advantages in Southeast Asia, variants that help process plant starches, suggesting Denisovans had developed diets based on wild grains and tubers, variants that provide resistance to tropical diseases, variants that affect immune response, making populations more resistant to parasites common in warm, wet environments. But the Denisovan contribution wasn't just genetic. Some researchers believe it might have been cultural too. There's evidence that Denisovans had sophisticated maritime technologies. Some populations had reached islands in Indonesia and the Philippines that would have required boat building and navigation skills. When modern humans encountered them, they might have acquired not just genes, but knowledge. The rapid expansion of modern humans throughout island Southeast Asia, including reaches of Australia by 50,000 years ago, suggests they acquired seafaring capabilities fast. Maybe too fast to have developed them independently. The Denisovan contact might have been a knowledge transfer as much as a genetic one. As these hybrid populations spread across East Asia, they encountered new environmental pressures. The groups that moved into what is now China found themselves in river valleys of extraordinary fertility. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, these were agricultural paradises waiting to happen. Seasonal flooding deposited rich sediment. Rainfall was abundant but not overwhelming. The climate was temperate enough for a long-growing season. Natural selection in these regions began favouring different traits than in South Asia. Less emphasis on surviving extreme climate swings, more on social organisation and technological innovation. The archaeological record shows increasingly sophisticated stone tools, early pottery, evidence of semi-permanent settlements much earlier than in most other parts of the world. But perhaps the most dramatic adaptations were happening in the isolated populations of island and coastal Asia, groups that reached Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, New Guinea. These populations became isolated by rising sea levels as the Ice Age ended. Islands that had been connected to the mainland by land bridges became separated by miles of open ocean. Genetic isolation on islands creates evolutionary hotspots. Small populations, limited gene flow, unique environmental pressures. The result is rapid differentiation. Modern Japanese populations show genetic signatures suggesting thousands of years of isolation. Some genetic variants found in high frequencies in Japan are rare or absent in mainland Asian populations. Evidence of genetic drift and local adaptation working together. Similar patterns appear throughout island Southeast Asia, each island or island group developing its own genetic character. Not dramatic enough to create separate species, but significant enough to be clearly visible in modern DNA analysis. These isolated populations also developed unique cultural adaptations, technologies for deep-sea fishing, methods for processing toxic plants to make them edible. Social systems adapted to limited resources and small population sizes. When these populations were eventually reconnected through the development of seafaring trade networks, they brought together a stunning diversity of survival strategies and local knowledge. By 10,000 years ago, Asia was filled with human populations showing remarkable diversity. From the Arctic adapted peoples of Siberia to the tropical forest dwellers of Southeast Asia. From the altitude adapted populations of Tibet to the seafaring communities of the Pacific Islands. Each carried the genetic legacy of that original migration out of Africa. Each had been shaped by the Denisovan encounter. and each had adapted to their specific environment through thousands of generations of natural selection. But the diversity wasn't just genetic, it was cultural, linguistic, technological. Asia had become a patchwork of human adaptation, dozens of different solutions to the problem of survival in different environments. And this diversity would prove crucial, because what came next would require every ounce of human ingenuity these populations possessed. The agricultural revolution was about to begin, and in Asia it would happen not once, but multiple times, in multiple places, creating the foundation for civilizations that would eventually become home to most of humanity. Now forget everything you think you know about how humans reach the Americas, because the truth is so much stranger and more fascinating than the simple story you probably learned in school. Picture this. 20,000 years ago, at the height of the last ice age, you could walk from Siberia to Alaska. Not across ice, though there was plenty of that. Across land, solid ground stretching for 1,000 miles, connecting two continents that are now separated by 50 miles of frigid ocean. This wasn't some narrow strip of beach you could cross in a day. This was an entire subcontinent, a massive grassland ecosystem bigger than modern Alaska and Washington combined. Scientists call it Beringia, and it was the gateway to an entire hemisphere. But here's what makes this story incredible. Humans didn't just stroll across this land bridge the moment it appeared. They waited. For thousands of years they lived on Beringia itself, trapped between massive ice sheets that blocked further movement. Isolated, evolving, adapting to one of the harshest environments on Earth. And when they finally made it through to the Americas, they found something unprecedented. 2 entire continents with almost no human presence. Virgin territory stretching from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego. And they filled it so fast that archaeologists are still arguing about how it was physically possible. Let's start with the geography, because geography is destiny. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea levels dropped by nearly 400 feet. That's like draining the ocean down to the 40th floor of a skyscraper. When that much water disappears, land appears, and the shallow waters of the Bering Strait, normally just 180 feet deep, became dry ground. But Beringia wasn't just a path. It was a world unto itself. Pollen records and fossil evidence show it was dominated by cold grasslands and tundra, what scientists call mammoth steppe. Vast herds of megafauna roamed these plains. Woolly mammoths, obviously, but also steppe bison, wild horses, cave lions, short-faced bears, and dozens of other species that are now extinct. The climate was brutally cold and dry, winters that could kill an unprepared human in hours, summers that were brief and only marginally warmer. This wasn't welcoming terrain, but it was passable, and for humans adapted to Ice Age Siberia, it was survivable. Now here's where the timeline gets interesting and controversial. For decades, archaeologists believed humans entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago, following what's called the Clovis First model. Clovis points, distinctive stone spear tips, suddenly appear in the archaeological record across North America around this time, suggesting a rapid colonization by a technologically advanced population. But then we started finding older sites. Much older. Monteverde in Chile shows clear evidence of human occupation 14,500 years ago. White Sands in New Mexico has footprints dated to maybe 23,000 years ago, though those dates are still being debated. And genetic evidence suggests the founding population of Native Americans split from their Asian ancestors somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 years ago. So what happened during those missing 10,000 years? Enter the Beringian standstill hypothesis. And this is where the story gets really fascinating. genetic analysis of modern Native American populations shows something weird. They don't just share ancestry with modern East Asians and Siberians, they show this completely reimagines how the Americas were settled. Instead of struggling through an ice-free corridor of barren wasteland, the first Americans might have travelled by boat, hugging the Pacific coastline from Bering all the way to South America. The coastal waters, even during the Ice Age, were rich in marine resources. Kelp forests provided fish, shellfish, seals, sea otters. Coastlines offered relatively mild climates compared to the interior, and most importantly, boat technology would allow rapid movement over vast distances. We know humans had boats by this time. People had reached Australia 50,000 years ago, which required ocean crossings. There's no reason the Beringians couldn't have developed similar maritime adaptations. The problem is proving it. The coastlines they would have travelled are now 400 feet underwater, drowned when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Any archaeological evidence of coastal settlement is gone, buried under the Pacific Ocean. But there's circumstantial evidence. Some of the earliest sites in the Americas show heavy reliance on marine resources. The genetics of Native American populations show some intriguing patterns that make more sense with coastal migration than interior corridors. And really, it just makes logical sense. If you're trying to move thousands of miles through unknown territory, why struggle across glaciers and barren wasteland when you could follow a resource-rich coastline? The truth is probably some combination. Some groups travelled the corridor when it opened. Others took coastal routes. Some may have used both at different times. Migration isn't a single event, but a process that unfolds over thousands of years. What we know for certain from genetics is this. The founding population was small, probably just a few hundred individuals. They were genetically distinct from the Asian populations they'd left behind, having spent thousands of years isolated on Beringia. And when they finally entered the Americas proper, they spread with absolutely explosive speed. Within just 2,000 years, maybe less, their descendants had reached the southern tip of South America. That's nearly 10,000 miles. They populated 2 entire continents, adapting to every environment imaginable. Tropical rainforests, high mountain plateaus, Arctic tundra, temperate forests, grasslands, deserts, coastal marshes. Everywhere humans could possibly live, they went. This expansion was so fast that it shows up in the genetic record as what scientists call a founder effect on steroids. When you trace the genetic lineages of Native Americans, they all converge on a single small population that entered the Americas between 15,000 and 17,000 years ago. Everything that came after, all the incredible diversity of Native American cultures, from the Arctic to Patagonia, descends from those few hundred Beringian survivors. But they weren't quite alone. Recent genetic evidence has complicated the picture even further. There are hints of earlier migrations, ghost populations that might have reached the Americas before the main founding group. Some South American populations show genetic markers that don't quite fit the standard model, suggesting either multiple waves of migration or contact with groups we haven't identified yet. Some researchers even argue for a possible coastal migration from Polynesia, though the evidence remains controversial. And here's something that should blow your mind. Those first Americans weren't just colonizing empty land, they were transforming it. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of the American megafauna went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, short-faced bears, giant beavers, all gone. Was it hunting, climate change, disease? Probably all three, but human impact was undeniably part of the equation. The Americas these migrants entered were teeming with massive animals that had never encountered human hunters. No fear, no evolved defences against coordinated human hunting parties. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of mammoth kills, often young individuals targeted systematically. Within just a few centuries of human arrival in different regions, the megafauna disappear from the fossil record. It's one of the most dramatic extinction events in Earth's recent history, and humans were likely the primary driver. But this transformation wasn't just destructive, it was creative. As the first Americans spread across the continents, they began developing technologies and cultural practices adapted to their new environments. They weren't just Asian populations living in America. They were becoming something new. The long genetic isolation, the rapid expansion, the adaptation to radically different environments. All of this set the stage for the incredible diversity of Native American cultures that would develop over the next 15,000 years. By the time Europeans arrived in 1492, the descendants of those Brynnian migrants had created thousands of distinct cultures, speaking hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages, living in every conceivable environment, and they all traced their ancestry back to those few hundred individuals who survived on the grasslands of Beringia, waiting for the ice to melt, waiting for their chance to walk into a new world. The gateway had opened, and humanity passed through into its greatest expansion yet. Here's something most people don't realize. Your body shape isn't random. The proportions of your limbs, the breadth of your nose, even the thickness of fat deposits under your skin, these weren't chosen by your ancestors based on fashion preferences. They were sculpted by climate, carved by thousands of generations of natural selection, responding to one simple question. How do you stay alive when the environment is trying to kill you? 2 19th century naturalists figured this out before anyone understood DNA. Carl Bergman noticed something odd about animal species. The further north you go, the bigger animals get. Polar bears are massive compared to their tropical cousins. Arctic foxes dwarf desert foxes. He realized this wasn't coincidence. It was physics. Here's how it works. When you're warm-blooded, you're constantly fighting heat loss. Your body generates warmth, but radiates it away through your skin. The ratio between your volume and your surface area determines whether you win or lose that battle. A larger body has more volume relative to surface area, more internal heat generation, less proportional skin to lose it through. In the Arctic, being big keeps you alive. In the tropics, being big makes you overheat and die. This is Bergman's rule, and it applies to humans just as much as to bears. Populations that spent thousands of years in northern climates evolved stockier, more compact bodies. Those barrel chests and shorter limbs you see in populations descended from Ice Age Siberians. That's not cultural preference. That's thermodynamics written into flesh. Then came Joel Allen with an even more specific observation. Within the same species, populations living in colder climates develop shorter, thicker appendages. Shorter arms, shorter legs, smaller ears, narrower noses. Again, this is about surface area. Your extremities lose heat faster than your core. In frigid environments, long limbs are liability. They're frostbite waiting to happen, heat bleeding away into frozen air. Look at populations that evolved in northeastern Asia. Generations upon generations in the brutal cold of Siberian winters. Natural selection favoured every adaptation that conserved heat. Bodies became more compact. Limbs shortened relative to trunk length. Fat deposits shifted to provide better insulation over vital organs, but the most dramatic changes happened in the face. The characteristic features you see in many East Asian populations, the epicanthic fold over the eye, the flatter facial profile, the narrower nose, these aren't arbitrary ethnic markers. They're climate adaptations refined over tens of thousands of years. The epicanthic fold protects eyes from harsh sunlight reflecting off snow and ice. The flatter facial structure reduces exposed surface area in freezing winds. The narrower nasal passages help warm frigid air before it reaches sensitive lung tissue. Every feature served a purpose when your ancestors were hunting mammoths across frozen tundra. Compare that to populations that stayed in tropical Africa. Longer limbs relative to body size, more linear build, wider noses with larger nasal passages, all designed to maximize heat dissipation. When the problem is staying cool rather than staying warm, you need exactly the opposite adaptations. Natural selection doesn't care about aesthetics, it cares about survival, and survival in different climates requires different body plans. Now, think about the people who crossed into the Americas 15,000 years ago. They started their journey in northeastern Asia, carrying all those cold weather adaptations. Then they walked into the most environmentally diverse land masses on Earth. Some groups stayed in the Arctic. The ancestors of the Inuit remained in environments just as brutal as Siberia. Their bodies retained those stocky, compact proportions, short limbs, barrel chests, every feature optimized for heat conservation. They even developed additional adaptations, higher metabolic rates to generate more body heat, different fat distribution patterns, genetic variants that help process high-fat diets from marine mammals, but other groups kept moving south, through boreal forests, across temperate grasslands, into subtropical zones, eventually all the way to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. That's a journey through every climate zone Earth offers, and their bodies changed accordingly. Populations that settled in temperate regions developed more moderate proportions. Those who reached the tropics evolved longer limbs and more linear builds. Within a few thousand years, you had human populations on the same continents with radically different body types, all descended from the same small founding group. But climate didn't just shape bodies, it shaped metabolisms, blood chemistry, the fundamental ways cells function, and nowhere is this more dramatic than at high altitude. When you climb above 8,000 feet, the air gets thin. Each breath contains less oxygen. For lowland people, this triggers altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing. Stay up there long enough and you start dying. Your body literally can't extract enough oxygen to keep vital organs functioning. Now imagine trying to live there, not visit, live. Hunt, gather, raise children, survive winters. For lowlanders, it's nearly impossible, but some populations have been doing it for thousands of years. The Tibetan Plateau averages over 14,000 feet elevation. It's been continuously inhabited for at least 30,000 years. That's 30,000 years of natural selection solving the oxygen problem. And the solution is written in Tibetan DNA. Remember the Denisovans? That mysterious human species that spread across Asia? Modern Tibetans carry a gene variant called EPS1 that they inherited from Denisovan ancestors. This gene regulates red blood cell production in response to low oxygen. The Denisovan version allows Tibetans to maintain healthy oxygen levels without overproducing red blood cells, which would thicken blood dangerously. It's one of the fastest cases of natural selection ever documented in humans. A single gene inherited from an extinct species that makes high-altitude life possible. The Andes tell a different story. Populations there have been living above 10,000 feet for at least 10,000 years. They also adapted to thin air, but they did it differently. Where Tibetans reduce red blood cell production, Andean populations increase it. Their blood is literally thicker, carrying more oxygen per unit volume. They also developed larger lung capacity and more efficient oxygen processing in muscles. Two populations, same problem, different solutions. Both work perfectly in their respective environments. This is convergent evolution, natural selection, finding multiple paths to the same destination. But perhaps the most visible environmental adaptation is the one we all notice first: skin colour. Human skin colour exists on a spectrum from very dark to very pale, and that spectrum maps almost perfectly onto UV radiation exposure. This isn't coincidence or cultural preference, it's biochemistry. Your skin produces vitamin D when exposed to ultraviolet radiation from sunlight. This is crucial. Vitamin D deficiency causes rickets, bone deformities, immune problems, complications in pregnancy. You need it to survive. But UV radiation also breaks down folate, a vitamin essential for cell division and fetal development. Too much UV exposure during pregnancy causes neural tube defect and miscarriages. So your ancestors faced a delicate balancing act. Get enough UV to produce vitamin D, but not so much that it destroys folate. The solution? Melanin, the pigment that gives skin its colour. Melanin acts like natural sunscreen. It absorbs UV radiation, protecting folate while still allowing enough through to produce vitamin D. Near the equator, where UV radiation is intense year-round, dark skin is essential. It protects folate while still allowing adequate vitamin D production from abundant sunlight. But move north or south away from the equator and UV intensity drops dramatically, especially in winter. Dark skin in these environments blocks too much UV. Not enough gets through to produce vitamin D. Natural selection favoured lighter skin, allowing more UV penetration to compensate for reduced sunlight intensity. Over tens of thousands of years, human populations evolved skin colours precisely calibrated to their latitude. Equatorial populations stayed dark. Northern populations lightened. It happened independently multiple times. East Asians lightened their skin using different genetic variants than Europeans. Same selective pressure, different mutations, identical result. This is why skin colour tells you about your ancestors' latitude, not their evolutionary distance from you. A dark-skinned person from India is not more closely related to a dark-skinned person from Nigeria than to a light-skinned person from Europe. They just had ancestors who lived at similar latitudes. Then there are the adaptations you can't see, the ones written in digestive enzymes and metabolic pathways. Most mammals stop producing lactase, the enzyme that digests milk sugar, after weaning. No point wasting energy producing an enzyme you don't need once you're eating solid food. Humans were the same, until about 10,000 years ago. Then some populations started keeping dairy animals. Cattle in Europe and Africa, goats and sheep in the Middle East, yaks in Central Asia. Suddenly there was selective pressure to digest milk as adults. Extra calories, reliable protein source, especially valuable during winters when other foods were scarce. Multiple populations independently evolved lactose tolerance. Europeans developed one set of mutations. East African pastoralists developed different ones. Each allows continued lactase production into adulthood, but they're genetically distinct solutions to the same problem. Today, about 35% of humans can digest milk as adults. That percentage is much higher in populations with long histories of dairy farming. Among Northern Europeans, it's over 90%. Among East Asians, whose ancestors didn't keep dairy animals, it's less than 10%. Your ability to drink milk without getting sick is a window into your ancestors' lifestyle 5,000 years ago. It's evolution happening fast enough to be documented in historical records. Similar patterns emerged with other foods. Populations eating high-starch diets evolved more copies of the gene for amylase, the enzyme that breaks down starch. Inuit populations developed variants that help metabolize high-fat, high-protein diets from marine mammals. Japanese populations have gut bacteria specially adapted to digest seaweed polysaccharides. Every diet created selective pressures. Every pressure generated adaptations. Your digestive system is a record of what your ancestors ate, written in enzymes and bacteria. But here's what makes all this truly remarkable. These adaptations happened recently in evolutionary terms. Most of them emerged in just the last 50,000 years, some in the last 10,000. That's nothing, barely a moment in evolutionary time. This tells us something profound about human evolution. We're not static, we're not finished. We're still adapting, still responding to environmental pressures, still evolving. The differences between human populations aren't ancient divisions. They're recent responses to local challenges, and they're all superficial compared to our overwhelming similarities. The environmental adaptations that distinguish populations affect maybe 10% of our genes. The other 90%, the genes that make us human, those are virtually identical across all populations. We're one species that happen to spread across the entire planet. And in doing so, we encountered every environment Earth can throw at a tropical mammal. Different groups found different solutions to different problems. That's not division. That's flexibility. That's the human species being good at what we do best. Adapting, surviving, thriving in places where no other primate could exist. Your body is a map of where your ancestors lived. Every feature a story, every adaptation, a solution to a problem your forebears faced. We're all walking records of humanity's journey across the globe, living evidence of evolution's endless creativity. The first farmer who planted rice didn't know they were creating an empire. They just knew they were hungry. And the first farmer who planted maize had no idea they were building a civilization that would someday construct pyramids rivaling Egypt's. But what they did, these ancient agricultural pioneers separated by an ocean and thousands of years, would shape not just their societies, but the very bodies and minds of their descendants, including you. Around 11,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened simultaneously in multiple places around the world. Humans stopped running after their food and started growing it. But here's what's fascinating. They didn't all grow the same things. And that difference, that simple variation in which plants got domesticated would cascade through millennia to create fundamentally different civilizations. Let's start in the Yangtze River Valley in southern China. Picture waterlogged fields, humid air, seasonal monsoons that could either bless you with abundance or drown your entire harvest. Your ancestors they're looking at a wild grass that grows in shallow water. Rice. Oryza sativa to be precise. It's not much to look at initially. Wild rice has seeds that shatter and fall off when they're ripe, making them nearly impossible to harvest efficiently. But someone noticed that occasionally a few mutant plants kept their seeds attached longer, and they saved those seeds, planted them again, generation after generation, selecting for seeds that stayed on the plant, that grew bigger, that produced more grain. Within a few thousand years, they had transformed wild rice into something entirely new, a crop that could feed villages, then towns, then cities. But rice demanded something that would fundamentally reshape human society. It required cooperation on a scale humans had never attempted before. You can't grow rice alone, not really, not at scale. Rice cultivation requires elaborate irrigation systems, terraced fields cut into hillsides, water management infrastructure that could control flooding during monsoons and maintain moisture during dry seasons. Building and maintaining these systems required coordinated labor from dozens, sometimes hundreds of families. Everyone had to work together, plant at the same time, manage water levels collectively, harvest together before the rains came. This created what anthropologists call a collective culture. Individual achievement mattered less than group harmony. You couldn't be a lone genius rice farmer who did everything your own way, because your fields connected to your neighbours' fields, which connected to theirs. If one person screwed up the irrigation, everyone suffered. If one family didn't show up for the spring planting, the whole system could fail. The social structures that emerge from rice cultivation reflect this reality. Asian societies organized around extended family networks, emphasis on social harmony, respect for hierarchy, collective decision-making. These weren't arbitrary cultural preferences, they were survival strategies encoded into social practice over thousands of years. Now, jump across the Pacific to Mesoamerica, 7,000 years ago, in the highlands of what's now Mexico. Your ancestors there are working with a completely different plant. Maize, corn. Except it doesn't look like corn yet. The wild ancestor of maize is a grass called teosinte, and it's almost unrecognizable. Tiny ears with maybe 5 or 6 hard seeds. You could starve looking at teosinte and imagining it could feed a civilization. But someone saw potential, and they began the longest, most dramatic plant transformation in agricultural history. Over thousands of years, through careful selection and cultivation, they turned teosinte into maize, seeds that grew from 5 per ear to hundreds, kernels that went from hard as pebbles to soft and nutritious, a plant that could be grown in diverse environments from sea level to high mountain valleys. But here's the crucial difference. Maize didn't require the same level of constant cooperation as rice. You could clear a field using slash and burn techniques, plant your maize, weed it periodically, harvest it, store it. Much of this work could be done by individual families without massive coordination with neighbors. This created a different social dynamic. Mesoamerican societies certainly cooperated, built incredible cities and monuments, but their social organization allowed for more individual variation. Family plots, personal achievement, social mobility based on individual skill and accomplishment. The difference shows up in the archaeological record. Chinese agricultural villages show remarkably standardized architecture. Houses built to similar specifications, arranged in orderly patterns. Mesoamerican villages show more variation. Different house sizes, varied arrangements, evidence of family compounds that could expand or contract based on individual success. But the differences went even deeper, into the realm of protein, into the animals that would either transform human societies or leave them struggling for alternatives. In Asia, the agricultural revolution came with a package deal: crops and animals. By 8,000 years ago, Chinese farmers had domesticated pigs, chickens and water buffalo. Their neighbors to the west had cattle, sheep and goats. These animals provided meat, milk, leather, bone for tools, and most importantly labor. A farmer with an ox could plough fields that would take weeks to prepare by hand. But perhaps even more significant was what these animals provided without dying. Milk, eggs, wool, renewable resources that could sustain populations without depleting breeding stock. This created what historians call a pastoral revolution alongside the agricultural one. Entire societies organized around managing herds, moving them to new pastures, protecting them from predators and raiders. And here's where genetics enters the story in a profound way. Humans aren't naturally designed to digest milk after infancy. Lactose, the sugar in milk, requires a special enzyme called lactase to break down. Most mammals lose the ability to produce lactase after weaning, but in populations that kept dairy animals, a genetic mutation appeared, one that kept the lactase enzyme active into adulthood. This mutation provided such a massive nutritional advantage that it spread rapidly through populations that kept dairy animals. Today, most people of European and Central Asian descent carry this mutation. Most East Asians don't, because while they had domesticated animals, their agricultural traditions relied less on dairy. Native Americans almost universally lack it because they never had dairy animals at all. The Americas had almost no domesticable large mammals. Bison were too aggressive, deer too flighty. The megafauna that might have been candidates, giant ground sloths, mastodons, native horses, they went extinct shortly after humans arrived, possibly hunted to extinction by the same people who would later desperately need their descendants. So American farmers developed different strategies. They domesticated turkeys in Mesoamerica, llamas and alpacas in the Andes. But these animals couldn't provide the same range of resources as Old World livestock. You can't milk a llama effectively. You can't plough with a turkey. American civilizations would have to achieve everything they achieved through human labour alone. This had profound consequences. In China, by 5,000 years ago, the Yangshao culture was cultivating rice across vast territories. Population densities were exploding. Villages were becoming towns. Towns were becoming cities. The Neolithic transition from Stone Age to agricultural age was complete, and the ripple effects spread outward. Rice cultivation techniques spread from the Yangshao heartland eastward to Korea and eventually to Japan, southward into Southeast Asia. Each new region adapting the basic technology to local conditions but maintaining the core social organisation required for wet rice cultivation: collective labour, shared infrastructure, group coordination. The genetic signatures of this expansion are written in the DNA of modern East Asian populations. The movement of agricultural populations didn't just spread farming techniques, it spread genes. Farmers generally outbred hunter-gatherers by massive margins. Agricultural populations could support larger families because they had more reliable food supplies. They could store grain through winters that would starve foraging populations. So, as agriculture spread, farmer populations grew and intermixed with local hunter-gatherer groups. The genetic evidence shows waves of agricultural expansion carrying what geneticists call founder effects, specific genetic variants becoming common simply because the initial farming populations that carried them were so successful they overwhelmed local genetic diversity. In Mesoamerica, a parallel but distinct process was unfolding. The domestication of maize enabled the rise of the Olmec civilization by 1500 BCE. Massive ceremonial centers, sophisticated art, complex social hierarchies, all supported by maize agriculture. But they did it without the wheel as a practical tool, without draft animals, without metal tools for most of their history. The agricultural foundation was different, and it produced different innovations. Mesoamerican cultures developed incredibly sophisticated astronomical knowledge because agricultural timing was everything. Plant maize too early and frost kills it. Too late and drought stunts it. So, they built observatories, developed calendars more accurate than those being used in Europe at the same time, created mathematical systems including the independent invention of zero, which Europe wouldn't adopt until centuries later. In the Andes, high altitude forced another set of innovations. Potatoes became the staple crop, capable of growing at elevations where maize failed. The Inca would eventually develop thousands of potato varieties, each adapted to specific microclimates in their mountain empire. They created elaborate terrace systems that maximized arable land on steep slopes, built irrigation networks that channeled snowmelt from peaks to valleys. But they did all of it with human labor and llamas. While Chinese engineers were using water buffalo to power irrigation systems, Andean engineers were organizing thousands of workers through the Mita system, a labor tax that mobilized massive workforces for public projects. The health consequences of these different agricultural systems are written in ancient bones. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show dramatic changes from their hunter-gatherer ancestors, generally shorter stature, a consequence of less diverse diets, more dental problems from grain-based diets high in carbohydrates, evidence of nutritional deficiencies like anemia, but the specifics varied. Rice-eating populations showed different patterns of dental wear than maize-eating ones. Asian populations that kept dairy animals showed different calcium metabolism than American populations that didn't. The very structure of human teeth, jaws, and digestive systems began diverging based on what foods dominated in different regions. Population density told another story. By 2,000 years ago, China supported populations in the tens of millions. Vast agricultural landscapes feeding cities that dwarfed anything in the Americas. The carrying capacity of rice agriculture, especially combined with other domesticated crops like millet and wheat in northern regions, was extraordinary. The Americas supported impressive populations too. Central Mexico and the Andean highlands were densely populated, but the overall numbers were lower. Some historians estimate the entire pre-Columbian Americas held perhaps 50 to 100 million people. China alone had comparable numbers. This population difference would have catastrophic consequences when these worlds finally collided. But that's a story for later. For now, what matters is understanding how agriculture, this transition from foraging to farming, didn't just change what humans ate. It changed who humans were. Different crops demanded different social organizations. Different animals provided different resources. Different environments required different innovations. And over thousands of years, these differences accumulated. They shaped cultures, influenced genetics, created the diverse human societies that would eventually encounter each other and wonder why they were so different. The answer was there all along, buried in ancient rice paddies and maize fields, in the bones of domesticated pigs and llamas, in the genetics of populations that could or couldn't digest milk. The agricultural revolution wasn't one revolution, it was many, and each one wrote its own chapter in the human story. Geography doesn't just shape where people live, it shapes how they think, who they meet, what diseases they encounter, and ultimately how their bodies and cultures evolve. And here's what most people miss. The difference between American and Asian populations wasn't just about time or distance, it was about connectivity, about whether your ancestors spent thousands of years meeting new people and exchanging ideas, or whether they spent those same millennia isolated, developing in their own unique direction. Let's start with the most important geographical fact that explains why Asian and European populations evolved so differently from those in the Americas. Continental orientation. Sounds boring, right? But this one feature, whether a landmass runs east-west or north-south, changed everything. Eurasia stretches roughly 13,000 miles from Portugal to Japan, but here's the key. It's almost entirely horizontal. You can travel from Western Europe to Eastern China while staying within roughly the same latitude band. You know what that means? Similar day lengths, similar seasonal patterns, similar temperature ranges, similar growing conditions. A crop domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, wheat for example, could spread across thousands of miles because it was adapted to similar climates all along that east-west axis. Same with animals, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep. They could be traded and adopted by cultures separated by thousands of miles because the environmental conditions remained roughly compatible. But the Americas, they run north-south, 9,000 miles from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, crossing every climate zone imaginable. Arctic tundra, temperate forests, tropical jungles, high-altitude plateaus, and everything in between. A crop domesticated in Mexico faced enormous barriers to reaching the Andes or the Mississippi Valley. Not because ancient Americans weren't smart enough to trade or travel, but because a plant adapted to grow at one latitude often wouldn't survive at another. The narrow Isthmus of Panama created a bottleneck. Tropical diseases and dense jungle made travel between North and South America incredibly difficult. The result? Agricultural innovations that should have spread throughout the continents instead remained localized. Civilizations developed in isolation, each solving the same basic problems independently, rather than building on each other's innovations. Now contrast that with Asia. By 2,000 years ago, the Silk Road connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. But calling it the Silk Road is misleading. It was actually a complex network of trade routes, some crossing high mountain passes, others skirting vast deserts, all of them connecting disparate populations in a web of exchange that had no equivalent in the Americas. Chinese merchants travelling west encountered Central Asian nomads who had perfected horse breeding. Those nomads traded with Persian merchants who had developed advanced irrigation techniques. Persian ideas flowed to Indian traders who had mastered monsoon navigation. Indian concepts travelled to Southeast Asian kingdoms who controlled maritime routes to China. Ideas moved along these routes even faster than goods. Technologies like paper-making, gunpowder, and the compass spread from China westward. Mathematical concepts like zero travelled from India in multiple directions. Agricultural innovations hopped from region to region. Within a few generations, a new variety of rice or wheat developed in one area could be growing thousands of miles away. But just as important as the connections were the barriers. Geography created boundaries that were permeable enough to allow some gene flow and cultural exchange, but substantial enough to maintain distinct populations, the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, cutting right through the heart of Asia. For most of human history, these mountains were nearly impassable. Populations north and south of them developed along different trajectories. The Tibetan populations we discussed earlier, with their Denisovan-derived high-altitude adaptations, remained genetically distinct from lowland Chinese populations just a few hundred miles away. The mountains didn't prevent all contact. Trade routes crossed high passes, usually during narrow windows of summer weather. Buddhist monks carried ideas from India to China and back, but the flow was slow enough, restricted enough, that it didn't homogenize the populations on either side. The same pattern repeats across Asia. The Taklamakan Desert in western China, so hostile that its name literally means you go in and you don't come out. It forced the Silk Road to split into northern and southern routes around its perimeter, creating separate populations adapted to oasis life along its edges. The Caucasus Mountains between the Black and Caspian Seas, creating a complex mosaic of ethnic groups that still exist today, each valley with its own language and genetic profile. The Tian Shan Range separating nomadic pastoralists of the steppes from settled agricultural societies to the south. These barriers created what geneticists call isolation by distance. Populations closer together exchanged genes and ideas more frequently. Those farther apart remained more distinct. But here's what's crucial. None of these barriers were absolute. Every few generations, merchants crossed the deserts. Nomads moved through mountain passes during migrations. Coastal populations traded up and down rivers that cut through mountain ranges. This maintained enough genetic connection that no Asian population became truly isolated. Even groups separated by thousands of miles remained part of the same broad genetic and cultural exchange network. Now look at the Americas, the major civilizations, the Olmec and Maya in Mesoamerica, the Mississippian cultures in North America, the Inca and their predecessors in the Andes. They developed in near total isolation from Eurasia. After the initial migration across Beringia ended around 11,000 years ago, when rising seas flooded the land bridge, contact ceased. For 10,000 years, populations on either side of the Pacific evolved independently. Some researchers think there might have been occasional contact, possible Polynesian voyages reaching South America, maybe rare Chinese or Japanese vessels blown off course, reaching the American coast. But even if these contacts occurred, and the evidence is controversial, They were so rare and involved so few individuals that they left almost no genetic trace. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unforgiving, was a barrier that human technology couldn't regularly overcome until relatively recently. But within Asia, the ocean connected as much as it separated. Southeast Asian maritime cultures developed outrigger canoes and sophisticated navigation techniques thousands of years ago. These allowed them to island hop across vast distances, creating trade networks that linked mainland Asia to Indonesia, the Philippines, and eventually reached out into the Pacific. The genetic signature of these maritime connections is written in modern populations. DNA evidence shows waves of migration flowing from Taiwan down through the Philippines and Indonesia, then splitting eastward into the Pacific and westward toward Madagascar. Yes, Madagascar. That island off the coast of Africa was settled by Austronesian-speaking peoples who'd originated in Southeast Asia, voyaging thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean around 1,500 years ago. This kind of long-distance maritime connection simply didn't exist in the Americas until much later. The Polynesian expansion represents perhaps the greatest feat of prehistoric exploration in human history. Between 3,000 and 1,000 years ago, these master navigators spread across the Pacific, reaching islands separated by thousands of miles of open ocean. They settled Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, creating a network of related cultures spanning a third of the Earth's circumference. How did they do it? They developed sophisticated knowledge of ocean currents, wave patterns, bird behavior, and star navigation. They could read the sea the way we read maps. This allowed them to maintain contact between islands, to deliberately voyage to new territories and return to report their findings. Even with thousands of miles between them, Polynesian populations remained connected enough to share linguistic and cultural features. Isolated, yes, but not completely cut off. American populations had no equivalent. The Pacific Coast peoples of North and South America developed maritime technologies, but they remained coastal. The distances were too great, the ocean too vast, the islands too few. A voyage from California wouldn't encounter land until Hawaii, 2,400 miles away. That's not exploration. That's suicide without the accumulated navigational knowledge that took Polynesians generations to develop. The result? American populations along the Pacific coast remained genetically and culturally connected to inland populations, but completely isolated from Asia. The Atlantic offered no better options. Even the narrowest point between Africa and South America spans nearly 2,000 miles. Without sophisticated navigation and purpose-built ocean-going vessels, it was uncrossable. This isolation had profound effects. Genetic diversity in Native American populations shows the signature of their passage through the Beringia bottleneck, followed by rapid expansion with minimal outside contact. Certain genetic variants became fixed at high frequencies simply because there was no gene flow from outside to introduce new variants. Culturally, American civilizations developed writing systems, mathematical concepts, architectural techniques, all independently of Eurasian influence. When Spanish conquistadors first saw Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, they were astonished to find a city larger and more sophisticated than most European capitals, built by people who developed complex civilization without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools for most of their history. That's what isolation does. It forces populations to solve problems with whatever resources they have available locally. But isolation also preserved diversity. Without constant gene flow homogenizing populations, American groups maintained distinct genetic profiles. The differences between Inuit populations in the Arctic and Amazonian groups near the equator became more pronounced than differences between populations separated by similar distances in Eurasia. Cultural practices that might have been replaced by imported ideas in more connected regions persisted for millennia in the Americas. Language diversity reached extraordinary levels. Before 1492, the Americas contained perhaps a third of the world's language families, despite having only a fraction of the global population. The contrast tells us something crucial about human evolution. Connectivity accelerates certain types of change. The constant exchange of goods, ideas, genes, and diseases across Eurasia created populations that were in some ways more genetically similar, but also more technologically advanced and more resistant to a wider range of pathogens. Isolation preserves uniqueness. It allows populations to develop distinctive features, both genetic and cultural, but it also limits the pool of innovations they can draw from. Neither path is inherently better. They're just different evolutionary strategies shaped by geography, by the simple accident of living on a continent oriented east-west versus north-south, near connected seas versus vast isolated oceans. The descendants of the same African migrants who crossed into Asia 60,000 years ago diverged not because they were fundamentally different, but because the land they walked shaped the paths they took. Geography had carved humanity into branches, some connected by threads of trade and travel, others isolated by mountains, deserts, and seas. And when those branches finally met again, after thousands of years of separate development, after Columbus's ships bridged the Atlantic in 1492, the consequences would reshape the world. By the time Europeans and Asians were building dense cities, raising herds, and sailing across oceans, their bodies had already been through a very different kind of bottleneck. Not one of climate like 900,000 years ago, but one of disease. For tens of thousands of years after leaving Africa, human groups in Eurasia had been slowly turning wild landscapes into domesticated ones. They were fencing animals, storing grain, piling waste, building villages that grew into towns that grew into cities. And all of that, every goat pen, every pigsty, every filthy alleyway, was a laboratory for pathogens. Imagine a farming village in ancient China. Mud houses gathered around irrigation channels, pigs rooting in the trash, chickens wandering in and out of people's living spaces, children playing with animals, adults tending cattle, everyone living close enough that a single cough can reach half a dozen people. Now picture something similar in the Fertile Crescent, in India, in the Mediterranean. Different crops, different languages, but the same basic reality. Humans and animals living together, breathing the same air, sharing the same parasites, passing the same microorganisms back and forth, generation after generation. This is where the immune systems of Asian and European populations were forged. Many of the nastiest infectious diseases you've heard of probably started as animal diseases. Measles from cattle, smallpox from something, like cowpox, influenza from birds and pigs, plague from rodents. Every time humans brought a new animal into their lives, goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, they weren't just gaining meat, milk, and muscle power. They were inviting in whole ecosystems of microbes. Most of those early encounters went badly. The first time a cow virus jumps into humans and figures out how to spread, people die. A lot of people. Maybe entire villages, but a few survive. Maybe they have slightly different versions of genes involved in the immune response. Maybe a random mutation makes their cells a little less friendly to the virus. Whatever the reason, they live, and they pass those protective variants on to their children. Over thousands of years, this creates what looks like immunity. Not invincibility, but population-level resistance. Children still get sick, some still die, but most people get through it and end up with long-lasting protection. The disease becomes endemic. Always there, always dangerous, but no longer apocalyptic. This is what happened again and again in the Old World. Waves of epidemics sweeping across Eurasia, burning through the crowded cities and farming villages, killing the vulnerable, leaving behind survivors who carry the genetic scars of those plagues. You can still see the evidence in modern genomes. Certain immune system genes, like variants of HLA, the molecules that help your body recognize invaders, are unusually diverse in European and Asian populations. Others, like CCR5, which helps some viruses enter cells, show signs of having been hammered by ancient epidemics. Some versions protect against HIV today. They probably weren't selected by HIV, which is too recent, but by older viral enemies that use similar pathways. Even skin colour might tell part of this story indirectly. Dense, sedentary farming societies in northern climates needed vitamin D from sunlight to support immune function, especially in children. As populations settled in places with weaker sunlight, selection favoured lighter skin, which makes it easier to produce vitamin D, not for beauty. For survival. Now, contrast all of this with the story unfolding on the other side of the planet. When people first crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, they brought with them sophisticated hunting skills, fire management, and the mental toolkit of modern humans. What they did not bring was a zoo. Most of the really dangerous animal origin diseases of the Old World came from a particular group of domesticated mammals: cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and later, dense networks of horses and chickens. The Americas had incredibly rich ecosystems: mammoths, giant sloths, camels, horses. But many of the large mammals went extinct near the end of the last ice age, likely from a combination of climate change and human hunting pressure. That meant that when Native American societies later developed agriculture, they were working mostly with plants: maize, beans, squash, potatoes, cassava. They domesticated some animals: dogs, turkeys, llamas, guinea pigs. But they didn't end up with massive mixed-species barnyards on the Old World scale. No oceans of cattle, no pigs living inside houses, no chickens roosting in rafters above human beds across an entire continent. Fewer domesticated animals means fewer opportunities for animal diseases to adapt to humans. And because the great cities of Mesoamerica and the Andes rose later than the first urban centres in Eurasia, there was also less time for dense urban diseases to evolve, spread, and stabilize into childhood infections the way measles and smallpox did in the Old World. This doesn't mean the Americas were disease-free, far from it. There were parasites and pathogens like Chagas disease, various intestinal worms, and probably forms of syphilis or related treponemal infections. But what seems to have been largely missing were those crowd diseases, infections that rely on big, dense, interconnected populations to keep themselves going. Viruses that rip through a city, kill quickly, and then move on to the next city before they burn out. So by the time ships from Europe began crossing the Atlantic at the end of the 15th century, you have two hemispheres with very different disease histories. On one side, Afro-Eurasia, with populations that had been marinating in zoonotic diseases, urban plagues and repeated epidemics for thousands of years, shaped by constant exposure, culled periodically by waves of smallpox, measles, bubonic plague, influenza, typhus. On the other side, the Americas, with sophisticated civilizations, complex agriculture, astronomical knowledge, monumental architecture, but without long intimate histories with animals like cows and pigs, and without centuries of exposure to those particular old-world crowd diseases. When Europeans stepped ashore in the Caribbean, Mexico, or along the coasts of North and South America, they didn't come alone. Invisible armies travelled with them, viruses and bacteria perfectly adapted to exploit human bodies in dense Old World societies. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, later cholera. To a European or Asian peasant in the 1500s, these were familiar horrors. Children might bear scarred faces from surviving smallpox. Families might remember a bad measles year. Whole villages might have stories of the time the sickness came and took half the town. Deadly, yes, but known. To most Native American populations, they were something else entirely. Imagine a pathogen designed for a city of 100,000 people, flash flooding through tightly packed neighborhoods, bouncing from host to host. Now introduce that pathogen into a population with no evolutionary history of exposure, no inherited partial resistance, no immunological memory. A population where almost everyone is susceptible all at once. The result was not an epidemic. It was a series of continent-spanning catastrophes. In some regions, up to 70, 80, even 90% of the population died within a few generations, not in a single moment, but in waves. Smallpox arriving with one set of sailors, measles with another, influenza over and over, mutating, returning. In central Mexico alone, repeated epidemics turned once bustling valleys of millions into landscapes of survivors and empty villages. It wasn't just the direct killing power of the diseases. When so many adults die so quickly, fields go untilled, crops rot, children are left alone, social networks collapse. Starvation follows infection. Grief follows grief. People move to escape the sickness and spread it unknowingly into new territories. Why were Native American populations so vulnerable, beyond the obvious no prior exposure answer? Part of it is just immunology. The first time your immune system encounters a virus like smallpox, it has to figure out how to respond from scratch. That takes time. If the virus is fast and lethal, there may not be enough time. But there may also have been genetic differences in baseline susceptibility. Remember that in Eurasia, countless generations had already been filtered, over and over, by exposure to similar pathogens. People with certain immune system variants had already been weeded out by previous plagues. By 1500, many Old World populations likely carried a higher frequency of variants that happened, by chance and by selection, to offer some protection against these diseases. Native American populations never went through those specific filters. Their immune genes had been shaped by other threats, local parasites, different pathogens, different environments. In some cases, their genetic diversity at key immune loci may have been lower, a consequence of the small founding populations that crossed into the Americas and then expanded. Lower diversity can mean fewer different strategies for fighting off a brand new invader. The Columbian exchange, the massive world-changing transfer of plants, animals, people, and microbes between the old and new worlds, was not just about tomatoes going to Italy and horses coming to the Great Plains. It was a biological collision that rewrote the genetic landscape of entire continents. Old World crops like wheat, sugarcane, and rice spread across the Americas. New World crops like maize, potatoes, and cassava exploded in Europe, Africa, and Asia, fueling population booms. Horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep transformed American ecosystems and lifeways. But the biggest, most permanent changes were often invisible. In the Americas, the massive loss of life from introduced diseases reshaped who had children and who didn't. Surviving native communities were those that, by luck or by genetic advantage, resisted the worst infections just enough to persist. Over time, their descendants would carry slightly different immune system profiles than their ancestors had, shaped by those centuries of brutal contact. Then came another layer, admixture. European colonists, African slaves forcibly transported across the Atlantic, and indigenous peoples all interbred, sometimes voluntarily, often under conditions of violence and coercion. Their genes mingled, including genes for immune function. Variants that had been tested for centuries in Old World plague zones now mingled with variants shaped by American environments. Today, if you look at the genomes of people in Latin America, the Caribbean, or many parts of North America, you see this mixed heritage written clearly. Segments of DNA tracing back to indigenous American ancestors. Segments from West Africa, from Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, China, and elsewhere. Immune system genes that show signatures of selection after European contact. Natural selection still quietly tuning the balance between resistance and vulnerability. Even the pathogens changed. Some New World diseases may have spread back to Europe. Syphilis, or a close cousin, likely made that journey, evolving, adapting, leaving its own marks on Old World populations. Malaria, brought to the Americas with African slaves and European settlers, adapted to new mosquito species, becoming a new enemy for native and non-native Americans alike. If you zoom out, you see a pattern that connects back to everything that came before. Early humans shaped by a climate bottleneck, Eurasian farmers shaped by animal-borne plagues, Native Americans shaped by isolation, and then by catastrophe and mixing. Every step in the story written not just in bones and ruins, but in the tiny variations of DNA that influence how our bodies react when something microscopic tries to make a home inside us. When you walk through a modern American city at night, past restaurants serving tacos and sushi and pizza, past people whose faces reflect every corner of the world, you're also walking through the living legacy of the Columbian exchange. Not just in culture, not just in language, but in immune systems that are mosaics of old world and new, of survivors from countless epidemics, of ancestors who endured plagues we barely remember. Disease did more than kill. It carved the branches of the human family tree, redirected migrations, toppled empires, and fused once separated peoples into new genetic lineages. It helped create the modern Americas, biologically mixed, immunologically complex, a place where the ghosts of past pathogens still whisper in our DNA. And yet, under all those differences, the same ancient signature remains: the fused chromosome, the neural wiring for language, the deep capacity for cooperation and adaptation. No matter how differently we evolved in Asia, Europe, or the Americas, we are still, all of us, descendants of the same tiny band of survivors who made it through that first great bottleneck long before anyone had ever heard of smallpox or ships or a place called the New World. Now zoom forward in time, past the ice sheets, past the first villages, past the rise and fall of empires, all the way into a quiet, fluorescent-lit laboratory where a technician in a white coat is doing something your ancestors could never have imagined. They're spinning tiny tubes of clear liquid in a humming machine. Inside those tubes are fragments of DNA pulled from a cheek swab, a blood sample, or sometimes from the powdered dust of an ancient bone buried for tens of thousands of years. That swirling liquid is us. Africans, Asians, indigenous Americans, Europeans, Pacific Islanders. All of human history dissolved into spirals of code waiting to be read. When scientists started sequencing human DNA on a large scale, they were looking for answers to some very old questions. Where did we come from? How did we spread? And why do people in different parts of the world look, on average, a little different? The first big surprise was how similar we all are. Take two people from opposite sides of the planet, a farmer in rural China and a fisherman in coastal Peru, a banker in New York and a herder in Mongolia. To the eye they might seem very different, but if you compare their DNA base by base, letter by letter, you find that on average they are more than 99.9% identical. All the visible diversity of our species, skin colours, eye shapes, hair textures, height differences, is written into a tiny sliver of that remaining fraction of a percent. And even that fraction isn't neatly carved into races. It's smeared across the map like watercolour paint, blending and bleeding from one region into the next. Modern genetics confirms what the bottleneck already hinted at. We are a recently evolved, tightly knit species. The differences between human populations are real enough to study, but small enough that they never come close to making us separate species. We are, in a deep biological sense, still one extended family, but if the differences are small, why do they sometimes seem so striking? To answer that, geneticists started looking not just at how similar we are, but where the differences cluster. Most of our DNA quietly hums along doing the same job in every human being, building cells, keeping metabolism running, repairing damage. But sprinkled throughout the genome are places where evolution has nudged different populations in slightly different directions. Imagine walking through a vast library, millions of books long, almost every page the same. Every so often you find a line that's been edited, a word changed, a sentence added, a margin note scribbled in by natural selection, responding to some local challenge. Cold winters, tropical diseases, high altitudes, new foods. In East Asia, for example, some of those editorial notes involve traits you can see on the surface. Variants near the EDAR gene, common in many East Asian and some Native American populations, influence hair thickness, tooth shape, and sweat, glands. One tiny change in a single gene can make hair strands thicker, straighter, more resistant to breakage. Over thousands of years that trait spread, probably because it carried some subtle survival advantage in those environments, or simply because of chance and social dynamics. Other variants are invisible but powerful. Many East Asian populations carry genetic changes that fine-tune how the body processes starch, reflecting long histories of rice, millet or wheat agriculture. Others alter the way alcohol is metabolized, leading to the characteristic Asian flush in some people who drink. That uncomfortable flush turns out to be an evolutionary nudge, a built-in warning system that can reduce heavy drinking and protect against some health risks. Cross the Pacific, follow the memory of the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, and you see a different pattern. Indigenous American populations today still carry echoes of their Asian ancestors, but also signs of their own long isolated adventure. Genetic variants have been shaped by life in everything from Arctic tundra to Amazonian rainforest. In some northern indigenous groups, genes related to fat metabolism look finely tuned for cold climates and high-fat marine-based diets. In highland communities of the Andes, other variants help red blood cells cope with thin air, a different solution to the same problem that Tibetans and Ethiopians solved in their own ways. That's convergent evolution in action. The same kind of environment, the same biological challenge, but different populations, separated by vast distances and thousands of years, evolve distinct genetic answers. Think of it like three inventors trying to keep a house warm in winter. One builds a thick stone fireplace, another perfects underfloor heating. A third invents insulated walls. Different designs, same problem, same physics. Human evolution does this again and again. High altitude tolerance in Tibet, Ethiopia and the Andes. Light skin at high latitudes in Europe and parts of East Asia. Lactose tolerance in herding cultures from Europe to parts of Africa and the Middle East. Different genes, different mutations, converging towards similar outcomes because the environment is asking the same question. When you look at indigenous peoples of the Americas and many East Asian groups, you can see some recurring themes. Adaptations to cold climates in northern latitudes, changes in fat metabolism and body structure that make long-distance movement and endurance more efficient. In some indigenous American communities, traces of ancient adaptations to heavy pathogen loads in tropical forests. In others, variants that may have helped ancestors survive harsh, resource-scarce winters on the Great Plains or in subarctic Canada. But these patterns are never clean lines on a map. They're gradients, mosaics. Genetic variation doesn't respect the borders we draw on globes and history books. For a long time, people tried to cram this messy, beautiful variation into a handful of racial boxes: European, Asian, African, Native American, Pacific Islander. But when geneticists map human DNA, those boxes start to fall apart. Imagine colouring every human on Earth by their genetic similarity. You don't get a clean patchwork quilt of distinct colours. You get a swirling, continuous spectrum. Neighbouring populations blend into each other. Edges are fuzzy. Where there has been a lot of mixing, at trade routes in port cities along old empire borders, the colours swirl together even more. Race in the old rigid sense doesn't show up in the genome. What shows up instead are populations and clines, gradual shifts in allele frequencies as you move across space. Some traits cluster more in one region than another, but they fade in and out like radio stations along a long nighttime drive, never snapping off all at once. Geneticists can, of course, look at your DNA and make educated guesses about where many of your ancestors lived. They can see signals of East Asian ancestry, indigenous American ancestry, West African ancestry, and so on. But these signals overlap and intertwine. Your genome is not a membership card to a rigid category. It's a time-layered map of migrations, encounters, and unions that stretch back tens of thousands of years. And this is where things become especially interesting for the descendants of those Asians who crossed the Bering Land Bridge, and for indigenous peoples across the Americas today. For centuries, colonization tried to erase their histories. Oral traditions were suppressed. Languages were banned. Sacred sites were destroyed or repurposed. Written records, when they existed, were often written by outsiders with their own agendas. But DNA kept a quiet, stubborn record. In the last few decades, many indigenous communities have begun partnering with geneticists on their own terms, not as subjects to be studied from afar, but as co-authors of their own deep histories. Ancient DNA from teeth and bones found in caves, burial mounds, and archaeological sites has been compared with the genomes of living indigenous peoples. The result is a more detailed, more nuanced picture of how the Americas were peopled. We can now trace multiple waves of migration from Northeast Asia. We can see splits and branchings as some groups moved along the Pacific coast, others through interior routes, others into the Amazon, the Great Plains, the Andes. We can see times when populations were isolated, when they expanded, when they met and blended. In some cases, genetic evidence has ended old debates. It has shown that certain oral histories about ancient migrations are not just mythic symbols, but accurate memories, carried in stories for hundreds of generations. In other cases, DNA has opened new mysteries, unexpected links between distant groups, hints of ancient contacts that archaeology has yet to, are not separate stories. We are chapters in the same book, paragraphs in the same long, winding sentence that began when a few thousand survivors stepped out of a climate catastrophe and decided, against all odds, to keep going. By the time humans had spread into Asia, crossed into the Americas, and settled into their new homelands, something strange was happening. Natural selection was still at work, of course. Bodies were adapting to cold winters, thin mountain air, tropical parasites. But more and more, the real driver of human change wasn't genes, it was ideas. Culture had become its own kind of evolutionary force. Beliefs, rituals, philosophies, technologies. They rose, spread, mutated, and sometimes went extinct just like species. But unlike genes, they could leap from one mind to another in a single conversation, or a shared ritual around a fire. Imagine two children born with almost identical genetic potential. One grows up in a Confucian village in ancient China, the other in an ancestral Pueblo community in the American Southwest. Same basic brain, same bottleneck legacy, but by the time they're adults, the worlds inside their heads will be completely different. Not because their DNA demanded it, because their cultures trained them to see reality in different ways. In East Asia, one of the most powerful cultural mutations took root around 2,500 years ago: Confucianism. It didn't start as a religion. It was more like a software update for how to be human in a crowded, complex society. Picture a world of warring states, constant conflict, fragile alliances. Into this chaos, Confucius and his followers proposed something radical. What if stability didn't come from fear or brute force, but from ritual and responsibility, from everyone knowing their role and performing it with care? Confucianism turned family into a kind of social skeleton. Filial piety, respect for elders, the idea that you weren't just an individual, you were a living link in a chain of ancestors and descendants. Your behaviour reflected on people who had died centuries before you were born, and on people who hadn't yet taken their first breath. That mindset didn't just shape manners, it shaped mating. Parents took an active role in choosing partners for their children. Marriages were alliances, carefully negotiated to preserve harmony, status, and continuity. Over time, this kind of structured mate selection created subtle genetic patterns. Certain traits, reliability, patience, willingness to follow rules, high investment in education, were rewarded socially and, indirectly, biologically. People who fit the system better were more likely to marry, to reproduce, to see their line continue. Layered onto this came another powerful Asian idea: Buddhism. Buddhism spread across Asia like a slow, gentle wildfire. Not by conquest, but by monasteries, trade routes, and personal seeking. It brought with it a very different way of thinking about self and world, impermanence, compassion. The idea that suffering came not just from the world, but from how the mind clung to it. In practice, this meant new cultural experiments. Monastic communities where individuals renounced marriage and family to pursue enlightenment. Networks of pilgrimage routes and shared sacred texts. A whole economy of temples, rituals, and donations. In some regions, this reduced genetic contribution from certain lineages, especially from men who became monks in large numbers, while increasing the status and reproductive success of lay families who supported religious institutions and gained prestige from doing so. And beneath these formal philosophies flowed something older: the animist roots, the ancestor worship, the local spirits in mountains and rivers. Asia wasn't just Confucian or Buddhist. It was a layered ecosystem of beliefs, with ideas interacting, recombining, and shaping behaviour in ways no single doctrine ever fully controlled. Across the Pacific, in the Americas, different cultural experiments were unfolding. Imagine the first peoples to cross the Bering Land Bridge and fan out over a vast empty hemisphere. Over thousands of years, they would fracture into hundreds of nations, speaking hundreds of languages, adapting to rainforests, prairies, deserts, and ice. What linked many of them wasn't a single prophet or a uniform philosophy. It was a way of seeing the world as filled with persons, human and more than human. In many indigenous American traditions, animals weren't just resources. They were relatives, teachers, or beings with their own agency. Mountains could be elders, rivers could carry stories. The line between nature and culture that would later dominate European thought simply wasn't there. This worldview created its own selection pressures. Hunters who paid attention to subtle environmental cues, who learned complex ritual protocols around hunting and Thanksgiving, were more likely to feed their families. Storytellers who could encode ecological wisdom into myths and sacred narratives helped their communities survive droughts, migrations, and shifting seasons. Memory, empathy, and the ability to internalize intricate ritual systems became valuable traits, culturally rewarded and indirectly favored in the genetic lottery of who survived and reproduced. Social norms around marriage varied widely. Some groups practiced strict exogamy. You had to marry outside your immediate band or clan, creating wide gene flows and reducing inbreeding. Others had complex prestige systems where the best hunters, the most generous givers, the wisest elders, or the most successful ritual specialists were the most desirable mates. In some societies, polygyny concentrated reproductive success in a smaller number of high-status men. In others, norms were more egalitarian. Again, ideas were quietly guiding which genes moved forward. Beneath all of this, another, cultural mutation was changing the game everywhere it appeared: writing. In Asia, writing systems crystallized early and in powerful ways. Chinese characters emerged as a way to communicate with ancestors and spirits, scratched onto oracle bones, then inscribed on bronze and bamboo. Over time, that system evolved into a tool that could record anything: laws, poems, taxes, medical recipes, philosophical debates. Chinese script was logographic. Each character represented a word or morpheme, not just a sound. Learning it required years of practice, intense focus, and a community that valued literacy enough to support that effort. The result was a scholar-official class whose main selection criterion wasn't wealth or birth, but performance on demanding written exams. Imagine what that does over centuries. Families that invested in education, that had environments nurturing verbal memory, pattern recognition, and abstract thinking, were rewarded with power and status. Those traits then became more likely to be passed on. Genes didn't know about characters and exams, but cultural institutions repeatedly nudged the evolutionary roulette wheel. Elsewhere in Asia, other scripts evolved. The syllabic scripts of Japan and Korea, the complex phonetic and logographic blends of Southeast Asia. Each system sculpted cognition slightly differently. What children had to practice to be literate. How easy it was to spread certain kinds of information. Which kinds of minds thrived in those environments. In the Americas, writing took a different path. The Maya developed a sophisticated writing system capable of recording history, astronomy, dynastic politics. The Aztecs and Mixtec used pictorial and logographic systems to record tribute lists, genealogies, and myths. The Inca built an empire without conventional writing, instead using quipus, knotted cords, to track numbers, accounts, maybe even narratives we still don't fully understand. But most indigenous American societies did not develop widespread everyday writing systems before European contact. Instead, they poured their cognitive and cultural energy into oral traditions, visual arts, and performance. Sand paintings that encoded cosmology, wampum belts that held treaties and histories, songs and dances that stitched memory into the body. This didn't mean they were less advanced. It meant they had optimized for a different cultural environment. In oral societies, memory is king. The ability to learn, retain, and faithfully transmit long narratives becomes vital. Performance skills, voice, rhythm, gesture, matter. Social networks that keep stories accurate and alive become the main information storage technology. In literate bureaucratic states, like Imperial China or later kingdoms in East and Southeast Asia, the storage moves outside the brain into documents and archives. That frees up mental space for different tasks, but it also creates dependency on institutions that control access to written knowledge, different writing paths, different cognitive landscapes, all from the same bottleneck brain. While scripts and philosophies were reshaping minds, technology was reshaping daily life. In Asia, dense populations and long continuity in certain regions allowed technologies to accumulate layer upon layer. Rice paddies sculpted landscapes into geometric mosaics, demanding precise water management and cooperative labour. Metallurgy advanced from bronze to iron to steel, enabling ploughs that could turn heavy soils, swords that held sharper edges, tools that made more tools. Gunpowder, paper, compasses, printing, all emerged in Asia first. But their impact depended on how cultures chose to use them. Gunpowder began as a search for immortality, then became a substance for fireworks and eventually war. Printing allowed Buddhist sutras and Confucian classics to spread more widely, amplifying the reach of those philosophies. In the Americas, technological innovation followed different tracks shaped by isolation and available species. Without large draft animals like horses or oxen in most regions, American societies didn't develop plough agriculture in the same way. Instead, they engineered terraced hillsides, raised fields in wetlands, and the famous Three Sisters system of interplanting maize, beans, and squash. They domesticated crops that would eventually feed the world: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao. In some regions, metallurgy focused less on tools and more on ritual and status objects: gold ornaments, copper bells, intricate alloys that weren't practical as weapons, but pulsed with symbolic power. In others, stonework reached astonishing levels. Think of the precision-cut blocks of Andean architecture, or the great earthworks of North America, built entirely with human labour and simple tools. Across both continents, technologies changed who was valued and who had children. Skilled weavers, navigators, farmers, blacksmiths, builders, scribes, and ritual specialists. Each culture defined its own version of success, and then, slowly, its gene pool leaned in that direction. Underneath all these differences, a deeper similarity remained. Whether in an Asian temple school where a child chanted Confucian classics under the watchful eye of an elder, or in a plains camp where a child listened to winter stories by firelight, brains were being shaped by culture. Synapses pruned and strengthened according to what their societies considered important. Over generations, culture and genes danced together. Sometimes culture ran ahead, changing too fast for genes to follow. Sometimes genes provided slight nudges, tolerances for certain diets, resistance to certain diseases, that culture then amplified or worked around. And yet, through all this divergence, humans never stopped being one species. A Buddhist monk in Tibet and a Navajo shepherd in Arizona, a Ming Dynasty scholar and a Haida carver, a Maya, astronomer and a Korean potter. Their ancestors all passed through the same ancient bottleneck. Their neurons all fired with the same basic electrochemical language. Cultural evolution took that shared neural hardware and wrote an incredible variety of software on top of it. Philosophies that turned ethics into art. Rituals that tuned human behavior to ecosystems. Writing systems that carved speech into stone, wood, and paper. Technologies that bent rivers, fields, and metals to human will. When you look at the differences between Asian and American cultures, you're seeing the outcome of hundreds of thousands of years of this process. Not separate kinds of humans, not separate destinies. Just one adaptable animal, trying out different answers to the same ancient questions. How do we live together without tearing each other apart? How do we ensure our children survive? How do we make sense of death, of suffering, of beauty. Each region, each people, came up with its own experiments. Some lasted, some vanished. All of them are part of the same grand story. The story of a species that didn't just evolve bodies and brains, but also worlds of meaning. And that story was far from over. So now here we are, after deserts and ice sheets, after land bridges and rice paddies, after plagues, ships and gene sequences, you're lying in the dark, listening to the echo of a journey that started with a few thousand fragile lives in Africa and ended with billions of us scattered across the planet. When you zoom all the way out, the pattern is simple: time, environment, isolation, culture. That's it. Those four forces working together for tens of thousands of years are what made Americans and Asians look and live a little differently, while still being underneath it all the same animal. Time gave differences room to accumulate. Small changes in skin tone, eye shape, gut chemistry, immune defences, a mutation that helped one village survive a winter, a habit that helped one river valley grow more food. Left alone for long enough, tiny advantages become defining traits. Environment did the sculpting. Harsh Arctic light pushed eyes to narrow and faces to broaden. Blazing tropical suns pushed skin to darken and sweat glands to work over time. Thin mountain air tuned blood and lungs in Tibet and the Andes. Forests, grasslands, shorelines and frozen tundra each whispered different instructions to the same human blueprint. Isolation did the sharpening. Families on one side of a mountain range mostly married each other. Hunters on one side of an ocean never met the fishermen on the other, at least not for a very long time. Genes swirled in small circles, reinforcing whatever traits happened to work in that particular corner of the world. And culture did the accelerating. Rice and millet in the east, wheat and barley in the west, maize and potatoes in the Americas. Different crops meant different bodies, different diseases, different rhythms of work and rest. Writing systems, religions, philosophies and trade routes didn't just describe the world, they fed back into biology, changing who lived long enough to have children and who didn't. Put all of that together and you don't get separate kinds of humans. You get one endlessly adaptable species branching outward like a tree, each limb shaped by its own winds and seasons. Every face on Earth is a record of survival strategies. The epicanthic fold that protects eyes from glare and cold, the broad nose that cools and humidifies air, the compact body that holds heat in winter, the lanky frame that sheds it in summer. None of it is better. All of it is local solutions to local problems, written in bone and skin and blood, and through it all one thread stays unbroken. The bottleneck, the fused chromosome, the shared ancestors huddled in African refugees while the climate tried to erase them. Whether your family's story runs through Siberian mammoth hunters, Chinese rice farmers, Mayan astronomers, or European city dwellers, you carry their legacy. Intelligence under pressure, cooperation in danger, the ability to turn stories into tools and tools into survival. Our differences don't contradict our unity, they prove it. You can't get this much variety without a common starting point and a long shared road. Every language, every eye colour, every tradition is another verse in the same song, another branch on the same old tree. As you drift towards sleep, you can picture the planet on a night-side view from space. Millions of tiny lights, each one a descendant of the same small band that refused to disappear. Asia's megacities, North America's highways, quiet villages, islands, deserts, mountains, different customs, different cuisines, different myths. One human family. If this journey through time and across continents helped you relax, or gave you something gentle to think about as you fall asleep, you can let me know in a simple way. Tap like if you'd like to hear more stories like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in our species' story. And if you feel like sharing, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Somewhere in Asia, somewhere in the Americas, or somewhere else along the branches of this human tree. If you want to support the channel a little more, you can also join the YouTube membership. It's completely optional, only if it feels right for you, and your being here and listening is already more than enough. For now, you can let the timelines fade, the migrations slow, the maps blur into darkness. You're one tiny, irreplaceable piece of a story, almost 1,000,000 years long. One human, among billions, all relatives if you go back far enough. Let your thoughts get softer. Let your breathing match the slow rhythm of that long shared journey. One human family, many beautiful branches, and a quiet night to rest in.